Sleep eluded Stacy once more as she was brought fully awake by the sound of a girl screaming. At first she thought it had just been part of a half-dream that had been forming as she had been drifting off, but the scream came again with the full clarity of reality behind it. It was somewhere outside and somewhat distant, but unmistakable. None of the other girls in the room stirred at the noise, so Stacy quietly slipped out of bed and padded over to the window in her stocking feet. Once there, she slowly parted the curtains and peered out into the night to see nothing but empty parking lot. The screams continued, and Stacy was about to dismiss them as the sounds of a TV in one of the other rooms turned up too loud, when she suddenly recognized the squeaky voice strained by fear and pain as Brittany's. Her skin froze at the realization. She felt the urgent need to run out and see if the other girl needed any help, but she found that she couldn't move. At first she panicked at the thought that it was a reaction to Brittany's unfair attitude earlier, but as she pushed that thought from her head, she found that the only movement she was capable of was a subtle trembling. She was afraid. The screaming became more anguished as Stacy cursed herself for her inaction. She pushed and pulled at her own body until she finally lifted her arm and flipped the light switch sitting next to the door. Still staring out the window, she waited for the angry cries of the other girls to hit her ears. If nothing else, she hoped it would partially drown out those horrible shrieks of terror. The muscles in her neck creaked with tension as she tore her gaze from the parking lot and looked behind her to see that the three girls were still sound asleep, faces peaceful in their repose. "Hey," she tried to say, her voice barely coming out to a whisper. "Hey," she managed more insistently, then finally, "Wake up!" Soft snores were all she got in return. Strangely emboldened by this, yet frightened at the same time, she moved away from the window and stood over the nearest bed. With as much force as she could muster, she pulled her hands back and clapped loudly over the pretty brunette on that side. Getting no response, she moved to the blonde girl on the other side and actually grabbed her shoulder to shake her. She rolled over and completely ignored Stacy's efforts. "Wake up! Wake up! Wake up! Come on, help!" Even jumping on her own side of the other bed right next to the third girl and shouting at the top of her lungs elicited little more than a cough snort that shifted back into the gentle, even breaths of sleep. Stacy stepped down from the bed and started plotting her next move, then stopped and stared into the distance as she listened to the complete silence around her. After a few seconds of hearing nothing, she scrambled back to the window and placed her ear directly against the glass. Still nothing. The screams had stopped. She turned her head and looked out the window, but with the light behind her, it was difficult to make anything out. She reached over and flipped the switch back off, then gasped as she saw a man walking across the parking lot a few yards away. She could just barely make out the brown, black, and green splotches of his camouflage coveralls and the blue-white lightning of the lot lamps, but she could clearly see his heavy boots and thick work gloves. His face, however, appeared almost featureless. Stacy snapped her hands over her mouth to stifle a scream as the man stopped in his tracks and turned that almost flat, featureless face in her direction. He seemed to bore into her with eyes shaped like wide-lens goggles sitting under an oddly sloping forehead and a head of black hair. Standing statue still, Stacy waited, frozen with fear that the man with the goggle eyes could see her and would start walking her direction. She heard a thin whine start to escape from her throat, and to stop it she simply stopped breathing entirely. An eternity of seconds creeped by agonizingly slow as the two of them seemed to study each other in complete detail, staring hard enough to bore holes. Stacy found the urge to breathe an explosive sigh of relief as the man suddenly turned and continued on his way. Tears began to well up in her eyes, and her body shook with unreleased sobs. Brittany was dead. Stacy didn't have to see the corpse to know it had to be true, and somehow she knew it was her fault. She had tried to wake up the others, but it had probably been too late by that point, even if they had gotten up. She told herself that if she had only run out when she had first heard the screams, banging on every door along the way and making as much noise as possible, she might have been able to scare off the cheerleader's attacker, if not gather a huge group of people to help her fight him off. Instead, she had stood frozen, unable to help anyone or do anything of real consequence. And she cried in shame at her cowardice. "Hello?" Claire held her robe close around herself as she poked her head into the motel office. The lights were on and she could hear a small TV belting out the sounds of some late-night adventure show, but she couldn't immediately see anyone in the small room. Thinking the clerk might have stepped off into a back room somewhere, she stepped into the office and rang the small bell sitting on the counter. No answer, no shuffling of feet or the particular sound of doors being opened and closed. She could see the black and white TV set sitting on the desk behind the counter, but the only sign that anyone had been watching it at any point was an empty swivel chair sitting nearby. "Is there anyone here?" Calling out and ringing the bell again brought the same results as before, and though Claire thought of herself as a very patient woman, something about the situation was starting to put her nerves on edge. She couldn't quite put her finger on what that something was, but it was enough to make her walk around the counter and push open the single door sitting on the other side without fully considering her actions. A short, dark hallway sat on the other side, lit only by a dim bulb hanging from an old-fashioned ceramic socket. Claire stepped past the threshold and carefully opened the first door on her left. The sharp chemical smell of industrial cleaning solvent hit her nose as she looked into the small, dingy housekeeping closet. She was just about to open the door on her right when a sound from the other side caught her attention. Placing her head against the door's fall wood paneling, she could make out an irregular grinding noise. At first she thought it was some kind of machine, but she quickly recognized it as organic in nature and opened the door to step inside. The room beyond was a small lounge of sorts, with a scratched-up table sitting in one corner and a small cot in the other. A coffee machine and various minor condiments and plastic eating utensils littered the table, while on the cot sat the slumbering figure of the Nix-In clerk. His ragged, uneven snoring filled the small space, as did the acrid tinge of cigarette smoke. Though the smoke came from a cigarette that was still lit, it appeared that the clerk hadn't taken a drag from it in quite some time. It was nearly burnt down to the filter, but half of the tobacco still clung in the form of ash. Claire took a moment to thank goodness that the clerk had fallen asleep with the cigarette sitting in one of the crooks of an ashtray on the floor instead of in his hand over flammable clothing or cot material, then grew somewhat miffed that the man would fall asleep on duty at all. "Excuse me, sir," she said, pressing his shoulder gently. "Excuse me." The man's snoring became even more irregular for a moment, then settled back into a lower register. His lips smacked underneath the ball cap that he had pulled over his eyes, but that was the last reaction she could get out of him, no matter what she tried. Irritation turned to worry as Claire continued to try and wake him. She stopped and stared down at him, her head suddenly filled with thoughts that he might have some sort of medical condition, like narcolepsy, and that she should possibly call an ambulance for him. Giving him one more shake to be sure he wasn't going to suddenly come out of it, she left the room and stepped back into the office to jump in surprise when she saw a man wearing camo coveralls standing at the door. "Oh, goodness," she said, collecting herself. "I'm sorry, you startled me. If you're here to see the clerk, he's sleeping in the back room, and I can't seem to wake him. I'm afraid that he... I'm sorry again, but why are you wearing a mask?" Instead of answering, the man simply stared at her for a second before swiftly jumping over the counter and leaping onto Claire. He pushed her back against the office desk and clamped his hands around her neck, cutting off her windpipe before she could call for help, or even cough once as he choked her. Her back began to ache as he pressed her down with his own body, jamming the bones in her spine against the edge of the desk and bending her backwards until she was nearly laying down on the flat surface. She grabbed onto the man's wrist and pulled on him, but it was like trying to bend steel bars for all the good she did, and she could feel deep scratches in the skin along the area between his gloves and coverall sleeves. Looking over, she could see a small bit of blood ooze from those wounds onto her hands, realized how fresh they were, and wondered if the other person he attacked had managed to get away. As the techno beat of the adventure show on the TV beat in time with the blood trying to pump furiously through her head and darkness started to fold its way into her vision, she wondered if she would manage to get away. He grinded against her as he squeezed her neck tighter and tighter. Some small part of her felt disgusted at the movement, but another part recognized that there was nothing sexual about it. It only served to smash her further into the desk, as if the man wanted to crush every part of her, not just her throat. She found that her own struggles to push him back with her own body were becoming more and more feeble as weakness slowly suffused her from lack of oxygen. She looked up into the goggles that formed part of the mask and tried to see past the amber tint of the plastic with her fading vision. She couldn't be certain if what she saw was real or hallucination, but it almost seemed as if the eyes on the other side were closed, as if he wasn't even looking back at her as he killed her. Just as she was about to give up and accept her fate, the pressure came away from her throat as the man staggered back from her and turned to swipe at something behind him. As she lay gasping and choking for air, she could just barely make out several inches of what looked like a nail file sticking out of his back just above the right shoulder blade. Various items that had been sitting on the counter flew through the air around the man's form, some of them hitting him, more of them glancing off of him, and most sailing straight past to land on and around the desk. Through it all, the man didn't make a noise, merely trying to ward off the assault before running to one of the office windows and jumping through it. Claire heard the crunching of gravel and glass as the man made his escape.